Hello, everyone. I'm Joe Lombardo, the coordinator of the United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC. And with me today is Wyatt Miller, who is the newest member of our administrative committee. And as with other members of the administrative committee, we'd just like to introduce you to them by having them explain some issue that they're interested in or what kind of work they're doing. So today I'm going to be talking to Wyatt a little bit about the Palestinian struggle. For those of you that know UNAC, UNAC was formed kind of out of the fight for getting the peace movement to take up the Palestinian struggle. In the early days when we were founded, there were a number of peace groups that would all say something like, yes, of course we understand the Palestinian struggle, but we'll never be able to build a movement if we come out strongly in support of the Palestinian struggle. And at our very first conference, we had a debate on that question, and about a third of the people actually left UNAC over that, but the majority stayed. And today, there's no question that the anti-war movement needs to take up that struggle. And in fact, it's very central to all the work that we need to be doing. So, I'm going to be talking to Wyatt a little bit about that. Wyatt, can you put the struggle in some kind of history, or why is there a struggle? What has happened to the Palestinians in the past? Why? What's the conflict all about between Israel and the Palestinians? Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so obviously there is this thing called the State of Israel, which exists and has existed since 1948 on Palestinian land, and has been the source of a number of conflicts with the indigenous Palestinian Arab peoples of that land. Generally, our understanding in the Anti-War Committee, which is the group I organize with here in Minnesota, is, again, that it's a struggle over land. And it's often presented in the media as like a religious struggle, for example. But we don't buy that. We think the way to really understand what's been going on through the 74 years of the occupation is that it's about land, it's about colonialism, it's about imperialism. And you can see that if you trace the history, that the groundwork for Zionism, and which is the project of colonizing Palestine, was originally kind of sponsored by the British Empire, and then into the 50s and 60s, France played a bit of a role, and then moving on into more recent times, the United States took over sort of as the main sponsor and the main political, military, economic support base for the Zionist project of the occupation of Palestine. And that's nowadays we understand that as the United States. It's not, sometimes you hear it framed as the Israelis control the US. We see it as the other way around. And we're very straightforward about that it's the United States sees the need to have a strong base in the Middle East, in West Asia, or in North Africa, which has always been, or at least in the last 50, 75 years or so, has been trying to dominate for its natural resources and for its strategic location in the world, as well as for other political reasons. And supporting the State of Israel is of utmost importance to that broader imperialist project that the US is trying to play in that region.
Yeah, I think you could see that also if you just look at some of the recent history of Israel in terms of the bombings in Iran, the bombings in Syria, and really helping the projects of US imperialism in that whole area. Every time there is a struggle against imperialism, you could see that Israel was coming to the aid of the United States. And it goes the other way around, of course. The United States gives a lot of aid to Israel, but I agree with you 100% that it's not the tail wagging the dog. It's U.S. imperialism, which is on the lead there. In regard to that, it's always been bipartisan. There's always been Republicans and Democrats. Both of them have supported 100% the state of Israel. One of the things that the Trump administration did was move the embassy of the United States to Jerusalem, which other countries were unwilling to do because it's still disputed territory. There's still areas that have been Palestinian and areas that the state of Israel is dominating. He also recognized Jerusalem as the capital and also said that he would support the ideas of more land, that expansion into the Palestinian territory of Israel and the illegal settlements. But Biden seems to have not done anything to change any of that, and just took a recent trip to Israel. Do you have any thoughts on that trip, or anything that you understand that came out of it that shows where the Biden administration is at this point?
Well, I think it's just as you said. It shows that there really is pretty broad continuity between the U.S. administrations, regardless of political party, and it's shameful. Like for years and years, the line was always that moving the embassy to Jerusalem was a red line, that annexing the Syrian Golan Heights by Israel would be, these were sort of diplomatic non-starters that were being, they basically, that the United States claimed that they were going to never allow to happen in the interests of some peace process eventually taking place. But then as soon as Trump went ahead and did that, everybody just united behind it, because they've always, their interest has never really been in resolving that conflict. It's just been to support their beachhead in the region, which is the state of Israel. And it's also just shameful that Biden, had the audacity as part of this trip, after signing this declaration with Israel, which in as many words stated that the U.S. unequivocally, absolutely will be committed to just total military support, continuing the huge amounts of military aid that go to Israel, and continuing to support Israel just having like what they hope is going to be an absolute military dominance over the entire region. After signing that, Biden has the audacity to go to Palestine and say a few, pretty things about, trying to support the peace process. But it's just really absolutely clear that they're just trying to do the bare minimum to protect their PR, which is kind of in many ways is across the world in the anti-war movement. We see that the Democrats, they take very similar positions to Trump, and in many places they've continued the exact same policies that when Trump was president they characterized as extreme. Mm-hmm. And they just try to do it with a little bit better PR. And then of course Biden flew to to meet with some of the Gulf states and the Arab leaders who have pursued the normalization of relations with Israel, which mm-hmm. is such a terrible betrayal of the Palestinian struggle.
Absolutely.
And it shows that those leaders, most of whom are monarchies, and that they're not really reflecting their people. They're just doing their own political calculations as it relates to the United States, who of course is trying to have the upper hand.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of what Trump did, he did through these signing statements. It didn't go through Congress or anything of that sort, like moving the embassy or declaring Jerusalem the capital. seems like it would have been very easy for Biden to undo those signing statements. He didn't have to go, but he has done absolutely nothing. And the other thing about his trip was it was right after the murder of the Al Jazeera a reporter who was shot by the Israeli forces, Shireen Abu Akleh, who very, very clearly was shot by them. The bullets showed that it was from them, and yet they're still investigating. And Biden can't come out and say anything. I understand actually her family was in Washington last week to try to get Biden to meet with them and do something, but he wouldn't. I mean, it's just such a shameful situation. Do you have any thoughts on that or any of the other? Seems like there's been a lot more shootings and killings and conflict just recently. Do you have any?
Yeah, and it's an interesting point that you brought up kind of at the end there, that killing of the assassination really of Shireen Abu Akleh is what the main focus has been on in the media, and that's good. I think a lot of Americans who are getting their news, who maybe were paying a lot of attention in 2021 when there was the attacks on Gaza and there was a big upsurge of pro-Palestinian sentiment, kind of unprecedented in the United States. But people have maybe wondered if that's well, I don't know what people are thinking, but it's definitely not been in the media as much since then, and it's a good reminder to people that the occupation and the violence and the brutality and all the things that were raised last year are still present, in many ways escalating. But it's important to point out, as I think you kind of referenced, that the backdrop against which Shireen was assassinated was intensifying repression by the occupation forces in Palestine and resistance against it, especially in Nablus and in the West Bank in general, which we haven't really seen at that scale for a number of years, and as well as, of course, and it's been ongoing, the increased amount of solidarity across the field within Palestine, between Gaza and the West Bank and the various resistance forces in both those areas. And that's all ongoing, and I think it's important for people to realize that it's not a sustainable situation, and it's not something that can just be glossed over, which is, of course, what Biden is exactly what he tried to do. And the Israelis are even worse. They're just, they go and say to the American press, they say, oh, we're investigating her killing, and then they kind of go and put on social media, they just say, oh, they just make up whatever they want to say and say it, no investigation. I won't even repeat some of the stuff they say. I don't want to give any credence to it, but
yeah, it is really, really a shame, but it also shows that in this country, there's a lot that we should be doing and a lot we are doing. And you brought up the movement in this country. I know the Minneapolis Peace Committee and other folks in Minneapolis, anti-war folks, have really done a lot, really been some of the leaders and probably the protest movements in general, keeping in the streets and so forth during this period. But on Palestine question, do you have any thoughts about the movement and where we should be and what we should be doing?
Well, I'll start just by saying that, for all of the terrible things that are going on, like in the United States, I think we are seeing a sea change in mass support, moving away from Israel and moving towards the Palestinians. People are really waking up to what's been going on in the occupation and are starting to reject some of these tired old cliches that have been forced on us for decades about it being complicated, for instance, or that there's both sides have some legitimate claims where I think people are really starting to understand there's an oppressor and there's the oppressed, and the Palestinians are the latter. And so in the anti-war committee in Minneapolis, we try to build that sentiment basically in all fields, but we really try to build it in the streets. And we do that in all of our work, in all of our anti-war work. We work with a lot of other movements as well. We played a pretty big role supporting various groups with the Black Lives Matter movement and the George Floyd uprising. We do stuff with the immigrant rights movement. We just have a lot of experience building infrastructure and building capacity to take it to the streets, put boots on the ground, and make these a mass demand that people from all communities can come participate in and actually, disrupt things and show up, show out, and build energy. Because we think that's where it really comes from, is in the streets, where the change, the pressure on the leaders. Yeah, and so as it regards to Palestine, we work with a lot of different groups. We work with American Muslims for Palestine. We work with CARE. We work with the U.S. Palestinian Community Network. And we build coalitions. And we, like I mentioned, we also try to bring in, we connect it to other issues. We always are inviting organizers from the Black Lives Movement for Black Lives to speak, to make the connections between U.S. policing, who obviously, they go and train with Israeli occupation forces. They import the weapons and the tactics and the technologies. And there's kind of a circular relationship between the policing in the United States and the occupation military industry in Israel. And we've had a lot of success in terms of really mobilizing people. We help organize a big protest every year for the Nakba Day in May, which commemorates the catastrophe of when the ethnic cleansing, it didn't start in 1948, and obviously didn't stop then either, but May 15th is remembered as the day of the major ethnic cleansing campaign beginning in Palestine in 1948. And we're always ready to get in the streets fast for whenever there's the latest attacks on Gaza or anywhere else, really.
Yeah, that's great. That's really exemplary. I mean, one of the things you said, which I think is very important, is that there is a sea change in people's consciousness about the Palestinian struggle in this country. And we've also seen that, I think, in the last several years. Perhaps the biggest demonstrations that the anti-war movement has been part of have been when there's been attacks on Gaza, and we've been able to bring out tens of thousands in some cases into the streets. And I think that is really important. And the whole issue of bringing people into the streets, there's just no substitute for it, I mean, people can listen to arguments online or do whatever they want, but when they start taking the steps in the streets in a demonstration, they identify with the movement, and it really helps build the movement. And the other important part is the connection between all the issues. In UNAC, we like to say we're against the wars at home and abroad. And I think that's a real key element. We have to make those connections because people are radicalizing now, and there's an international component to the radicalization that's taking place in our communities, and there's also a community component to the wars that are going on around the world. So I think that's really important. Anything else you'd like to say before we end the discussion?
Well, I guess I'll just mention our campaign, our latest campaign here in Minneapolis, because it relates to what you were just saying. Like, we have been promoting and pushing the state of Minnesota to divest public funds, which are currently invested in the occupation of Palestine. And the really big thing there is the Israeli weapons company Elbit Systems, which there's been some really amazing activism fighting back against Elbit Systems at some of their manufacturing sites in the United Kingdom. And actually, Roger Waters, the musician, just played a show here in Minneapolis last night. He had a big inflatable pig flying around that said Elbit Systems on the side. So he was helping bring attention to this too.
Oh,
and so even though they're not actually manufacturing the weapons here, they have a lot of a big footprint in the United States. Elbit Systems is actually contracted. And this is ongoing. Trump, I believe, started this. It may even have gone back to Obama. I don't remember off the top of my head, but Elbit Systems is helping build parts of the border wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. They've been contracted to build some like high-tech stuff that was also part of continues obviously to be part of the occupation wall in Palestine. And they advertise it as such. They say it's been field tested, and they're talking about the brutal use in the occupation of Palestine. So we're working with a large coalition of groups to pressure the State Board of Investment to divest from Elbit, as well as a bunch of other companies and bonds. And that's part of a long-standing campaign that other groups have started locally. But again, what we try to do is bring a lot of groups together, bring in the immigrant rights movement in particular, and we're going to be protesting outside the governor's house on August 24th in St. Paul, and we're hoping for a great turnout. Again, I think people's minds are changing. We just flyered at the Pride Festival here. We gave everybody free Palestine stickers, and we had a really amazing response. Despite all of the propaganda, all the pink washing that Israel tries to do around, claiming that Israel is this beacon of like a oasis of LGBTQ rights in the region. We reject that, obviously. You can't have rights if you're under military occupation, if you have no freedom of movement, if you have no access to basic services, and so on. Yeah, the people at Pride, were just, we had petitions for them to sign. We got hundreds, over 1,000 signatures. And we're just, it was just a great experience to be able to see people, they see the Free Palestine stuff and they're just like, yes. And there's not nearly the level of confusion around the topic as there was even as recently as a few years ago.
Yeah, I think that's true. And you also see, you're talking about the border wall, and it's been tested. A lot of their weapons get tested on Palestinians, and that's used in their advertising. And of course, we've seen so many police departments being trained by the Israeli government and the Israeli police. And so we understand where their tactics against the Black community come from. They come from the tactics that Israel is doing against the Palestinians. Okay, well, thanks for doing this, Wyatt, and we'll get it up on the UNAC website and let people know about it, and talk to you again soon. Take care.
Thanks, Joe.